Welcome to a new video lesson. In today's lesson, I will analyze Pride and Prejudice chapter 8 to chapter 15. So, let's begin. Chapter 8 of Pride and Prejudice begins at Netherfield Park, where Jane has fallen ill and Elizabeth has gone there. So, she dines with Bingley and Darcy and then returns to Jane, who is still very sick. Miss Bingley begins to find fault in Elizabeth as soon as she has left the room. Both Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, who is the eldest daughter, that is elder sister of Miss Bingley, declare Elizabeth to be a foolish country girl with no style, taste or beauty, and comment that she looked wild and untidy after her walk from Meryton that morning. Bingley, however, finds nothing untidy about Elizabeth's appearance and appreciates her concern for her sister. Darcy feels that the walk has brightened her eyes. Elizabeth stays with Jane till she falls asleep and then comes to the drawing room to find the whole party playing cards. Elizabeth declines to play and examines some books. Conversation turns to Darcy's fine home, Pemberley, with its magnificent library, to which Darcy is always adding more books. The Bingley sisters continue to poke subtle fun at Elizabeth. When Elizabeth returns to her sister's room, she finds her wards. It is decided to call the apothecary early in the morning if Jane is no better. Bingley is concerned and uncomfortable. His sisters declare that they are miserable but are not really so. So what we find here is that at Bingley's residence, Elizabeth becomes aware of the extreme hypocrisy of the Bingley sisters. She notes how much Miss Bingley fawns over Jane, but knows that she will talk ill of her behind her back. She also notes how flattering Miss Bingley is to Mr. Darcy. Miss Bingley is clearly aiming to discredit Elizabeth in the eyes of Darcy, who resists her snobbish arguments, showing herself as a man of good sense. So here Miss Bingley's personality is being portrayed or described to a great extent. Miss Bingley is an example of desperate jealous. Okay, Miss Bingley's evil nature hurts others, though it is defeated in the end. She makes her evil entry into the novel in the company of a brother when Mr. Bingley comes to Netherfield. The first impression made by her, as well as her married sister Mrs. Hurst, on the villagers is fairly favorable. They are pronounced to be fine women with an air of decided fashion, quote unquote. Okay, they conduct themselves in a pleasing manner in the company. Jane agrees with others that Caroline Bingley is one of the sweetest of women, but such a verdict from Jane, who cannot think ill of anybody, cannot be taken to be authoritative. The truth is realized only by Elizabeth, who is able to perceive pride and haughtiness underneath the polished exterior of Miss Bingley. Okay, the two seem to have an instinctive dislike for each other, that is Elizabeth and Miss Bingley. Ultimately, Elizabeth's assessment of the character of Miss Bingley proves to be correct, that Miss Bingley's refinement is only skin deep is made evident soon after her introduction in the novel. Both she and her sister receive the Bennets courteously at Netherfield Park, and they make a distinction between Jane and other members of the family. Still, Elizabeth is able to note that there is an attitude of condescension on their part, and that Miss Bingley is kind to Jane only for the sake of her brother. This general attitude of superiority and contempt for those she considers inferior to herself turns into positive malice when Miss Bingley realizes that Mr. Darcy is interested in Elizabeth. Her malice finds vent when the first compliment is paid by Darcy to Elizabeth. She senses a rival. Okay? She senses a rival immediately, and she spits venom in a question when she can wish him joy in a compliment that Darcy would have charming mother-in-law. Her hostility towards Elizabeth increases with the passage of time. She is shrewd enough to realize that Elizabeth would be a serious rival to her. She misses no opportunity of passing derogatory remarks on Elizabeth, particularly when Mr. Darcy is by the side. When Elizabeth comes to Netherfield on foot in order to attend on Jane, Miss Bingley condemns her shocking country manners and impudence by saying this: to rouse the dislike of Mr. Darcy against the other. She sneeringly asks him how Elizabeth's eyes looked after the walk. Pat comes the reply of Elizabeth that they are vastly improved by the exercise. Okay. Darcy's personality is further revealed in this chapter when he gives his view of what qualities, of what the qualifications should be the wife must have. He speaks in long, involved sentences with slow deliberation. In contrast, Elizabeth answers him with certain precision and quickness. But in her answers, she sums up everything he had said earlier. She possesses a quickness of repartee as well as capacity for getting at the essence of an argument. In the presence of Elizabeth, Miss Bingley purposefully refers to Miss Darcy and begins to speak highly of her manners and accomplishments. From their talk is revealed the accomplishments of a lady during Jane Austen's time. Okay, a lady was supposed to be well versed in music, dancing, drawing, and languages, and these are the characteristics of the picture of the society is also presented. The gap between Darcy and Elizabeth is further diminished. Her preference for reading rather than playing card and embroidery makes her more attractive to Darcy than she was. They appear to be suited for each other, though Darcy is not quite prepared to go so far, and Elizabeth has not yet begun to depart from her original dislike of Darcy. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 9. In chapter 9, chapter 9 begins with the next morning. Next morning, Elizabeth sends a note to her mother asking her to come to Netherfield. Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her two youngest girls, reaches Netherfield soon after the family breakfast. She is not alarmed. She is not at all alarmed by Jane's condition, and she does not want to recover her health immediately, because that would mean her removal from Netherfield. So you see, as scheming as she is, also you can see these characteristics of Mrs. Bennet as a worrisome mother who would leave no stone unturned to get her daughters married. So therefore, she refuses to listen to her daughter's proposal of being carried home. The apothecary who arrives also decides that Jane is not well enough to return home. Mrs. Bennet thanks Mr. Bingley and his sisters effusively for their kindness to Jane, and in so doing makes an utter fool of herself. Elizabeth is embarrassed by her mother's behavior. Mr. Bingley is, however, unaffectedly civil and forces his sisters to be civil too. Lydia reminds Mr. Bingley that he has promised to give a ball at Netherfield. So what we see here is that neither the mother nor the sisters, the younger sister, is worrisome, is concerned about Jane's health. Okay, Bingley replies that he will do so when Jane is well again, that he will give the ball. Okay, Mrs. Bennet and her daughters then depart, and Elizabeth returns to Jane. Meanwhile, Miss Bingley and her sister criticize the Bennet ladies in the presence of Mr. Darcy, who does not join the censure. So, Mr. Darcy's remark condemning village life gives offense to Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet's rank vulgarity makes Elizabeth feel discomfited and Darcy embarrassed. Mrs. Bennet reveals her shallowness, her transparent ambition for her daughters, a streak of cruelty in disparaging William Lucas's daughters while praising her own, and an obtuseness in reading character. Her personality throws a light on the personalities of Elizabeth, who turns out to be long-suffering and tolerant, and Darcy, who is embarrassed for Mrs. Bennet yet sympathetic towards Elizabeth. Overall, Darcy can see that a bad family has not succeeded in ruining Elizabeth's character. She is all the more a marvel for having turned out well. The next chapter is also situated in Netherfield Park when Jane is a little better in the evening, and after dinner Elizabeth joins the party in the drawing room, where Darcy is writing a letter, but Miss Bingley, Caroline Bingley, is sitting nearby watching him and repeatedly distracting his attention by calling out messages to her sister. They talk about various things and analyze the temperament of Darcy and Bingley. All the virtues of the fashionable society like friendship, affection, discretion and obligation are discussed. After several interruptions for some time, Darcy manages to finish the letter and asks Caroline Bingley and Elizabeth for some music, where Mrs. Hertz and her sister, that is Caroline Bingley, sings, while Elizabeth stands turning over some music books. Okay, a thing that happens over here is that Elizabeth cannot help but notice how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes are fixed on her. But Elizabeth considers that Darcy only looks at her because he disapproves of her appearance. She has no inkling that he now admires her. So what we see here is that prejudice leads to misunderstandings. Okay, so Darcy asks Elizabeth to dance a reel with him, but she refuses. Miss Bingley is jealous and is glad when Elizabeth returns to Jane. The following morning, Miss Bingley walks in the garden with Darcy, offering advice on his future married life as she imagines it. So what we see here is that Miss Bingley has a crush or a liking for Darcy, and she tries everything in order to be in the good books of Darcy. Okay. Jane is better, and Elizabeth and Mrs. Hurst meet Darcy and Caroline on a path which is only wide enough for three. Caroline Bingley rudely leaves Elizabeth to walk by herself. Darcy becomes annoyed at their behavior. So the contrast between the two ways of writing is meant to be read as a contrast of two kinds of personality. Okay. Darcy writes carefully, slowly, while Bingley writes rapidly, without thought. So the contrasting picture that was drawn by the sisters, the Bingley sisters, are shown here between the contrast between Darcy and Bingley. Okay, there is an implicit compliment in this society in saying that someone can do things without thought, with rapidity. Okay, somehow this is more admirable than to be one of those who act slowly and with deliberation. This is not the view held by Darcy, and not the view held by Jane Austen herself. Bingley admits that his letters end in blots and convey no ideas at all. Okay. Darcy is a man of thought, of reason. He will get things done in his life, and his life will be much more stable. When Darcy mentions that everybody has a defect, Elizabeth remarks that Darcy's defect is his quote-unquote propensity to hate everybody. Darcy aptly retorts, and which can be said as, and yours is willfully to misunderstand them. So what we see here is that Elizabeth's prejudice is still working on her, like many of Jane Austen's heroines. She is blind at the beginning of the novel and must progress through experience and learning to a point where she is deserving of marriage. Darcy, in his turn, is tolerant of her coolness, realizing the unsatisfactory impression he must have made on the fascinating and intelligent woman. Indeed, her reticence impresses her favorably, especially when contrasted with the advances made by Caroline Bingley, who seems to share Charlotte's ideas of how to trap a man. Such may work with a Collins or Bingley, but clearly Darcy is a different kind of a man. Miss Bingley's character grows more detestable. The closer Darcy becomes to Elizabeth, she unwittingly helps to drive Darcy into Elizabeth's arms. Okay. The next chapter describes that Jane is able to come down to the drawing room after dinner. She is welcomed by Bingley Bingley ladies, who are very attentive to the sisters until the gentlemen join the party, after which Miss Bingley's eyes are turned to Darcy. Mr. Bingley is delighted to see Jane and sits down by her side, hardly talking to anyone else. Elizabeth occupies herself some needlework. Darcy reads a book, while Caroline Bingley tries unsuccessfully to draw him into a conversation with her. He answers her questions, that is, Caroline Bingley's questions, politely, but continues reading. Caroline walks up and down the room and invites Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy to join her. The former assents, but Mr. Darcy makes a sarcastic remark and retains his seat. Darcy and Elizabeth have a good-humoured skirmish with words. They exchange the ideas about the importance of laughter and jokes in life. Elizabeth says that she laughs at follies and nonsense. Darcy, very attracted by Elizabeth, begins to feel the danger of paying the young lady, that is Elizabeth, too much attention. Okay, so the discussion between Darcy and Elizabeth gives us an insight into one human quality which Jane Austen approves of. That is the understanding or reason, which must be in control of one's whims, follies, emotions. Hence, the relevance of Darcy's analysis of character, which is her main fault or weakness is willfully to misunderstand everybody, including Darcy, is quite correct. Because of her prejudice, she is farther from the truth that Darcy, who has already come to admire her analysis of his main weakness, that he has a propensity to hate everybody, shows how wrong she is. Elizabeth's comments about the laughing at the follies of men reflects Jane Austen's own attitude of viewing the world dispassionately and humorously. Chapter 12 begins in the next morning when Elizabeth writes to her mother and asks for the carriage to come and fetch them home. While the matchmaking Mrs. Bennet, however, is anxious that the visit should be further prolonged and sends a message that the carriage will not be available before Tuesday. Elizabeth is determined to leave and borrows Mr. Bingley's carriage to take Jane and herself home the following day. Bingley is disappointed that Jane is to leave and tries to persuade her that it is not yet safe for her to travel. But she is firm, that is Elizabeth I am talking about. Darcy avoids Elizabeth on the last day, and Miss Bingley is noticeably more civil at their departure, though she is actually happy to see Elizabeth leave. Mr. Bennet is glad to see them, but Mrs. Bennet is disappointed. She even does not welcome them home very cordially. This chapter ends the first stage of the growth of the two love affairs. Jane and Bingley are well on their way to solidify their union, if events like Mrs. Bennet's behaviors will only permit. They have found each other highly congenial. Darcy, perhaps realizing that his affair is moving too rapidly, is happy to have a temporary pause. He is a person who approves slowness, thought, concentration, deliberation. In his handwriting, in his writing of letters, and in writing everything. And in his love affairs too, circumstances have been to contrive perhaps to satisfy him. He believes that he needs time to recover, ponder, analyze his relationship with Elizabeth. Hence he welcomes the separation from her. Jane Austen herself had the view that taste, a calm thought and deliberation were necessary for true love and a good marriage. Anything done in a hurry won't be lasting long. Elizabeth is not yet aware of his feelings, that is, of Darcy's feelings, even though in other situations she has the ability to analyze people and their feelings, but in this case she is completely wrong. Okay. Chapter 13 begins with Mr. Bennet informing his wife and others that they are to have a guest to dinner. It appears that Mr. Bennet has received a letter from his cousin, Mr. Collins, who, after Mr. Bennet's death, will inherit the Longbourn estate. Okay, Mrs. Bennet has never been able to understand the entail of the property and rails bitterly against what she calls the cruelty of settling an estate away from a family of 5 daughters in favor of a man in whom none of them are interested. Okay, Mr. Collins is a clergyman, writes that he wished to heal the breach which existed between his father and Mr. Bennet. He proposes to pay the latter and his family a short visit and present the olive branch. When Mr. Collins arrives, he is received with great politeness by the whole family. He is a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25. He praises the looks of the Bennet girls, admires the house and furniture, and compliments Mrs. Bennet on the dinner. When Mrs. Bennet is offended, Collins assures that they have no cook and the dinner has been prepared by her daughters. He is profusely apologetic and continues to beg her pardon for almost a quarter of an hour. So, this chapter presents the letter from Mr. Collins, which prepares one to dislike the man even before he arrives. The letter is one example of Jane Austen's lifelong interest in writing style. For her, the style is a man. That is, a man reveals himself by how he writes or how he speaks. Okay, Elizabeth at once determines from the letter that this man, that Mr. Collins, is very pompous, a mixture of servility and self-importance. This is exactly what Mr. Collins proves to be. This again suggests Elizabeth's great perceptive ability with every situation except in her relationship with Darcy. Okay, Mr. Collins is one of the most distasteful characters in the English novel, yet in a harmless way. He is pompous and foolish, lacking any zeal, lacking any real strength of character. Okay, his effusive compliments of Bennet girls is a forewarning for his real purpose of visit, which is to marry one of them. Chapter 14 describes Mr. Collins' life in much more detail. Mr. Collins has obtained his parish through the patronage of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and he is eloquent in his praise of that lady, a wealthy widow with an only daughter. This young lady unfortunately suffers from indifferent health, which Mr. Collins informs them precludes her from taking her rightful place in society. Mr. Collins repeats some of the compliments he has paid to his patroness and her daughter. Mr. Bennet listens with the keenest enjoyment, for he finds his cousin as absurd as he had hoped. After the tea, they go into the drawing room, where Mr. Collins, after declaring his honor of novels, commences to read aloud from Froude's sermons. Lydia, however, interrupts with a frivolous comment about an army officer, and Mr. Collins, disgusted, suggests to Mr. Bennet that they play backgammon. The rest of the evening is taken up with this game. In Mr. Collins's conversation, Jane Austen has adapted her style to fit his pompous and deliberate speech. This characteristic is one of Miss Austen's most skillful techniques. Mr. Collins is revealed to be an unlikable person who is capable only of conventional thinking and absurd ambitions. He is false, hypocritical, and pretentious. He makes an effort to present himself in such a way where the importance of him will be presented, but he makes a perfect foil for the sensible people like Mr. Bennet and Elizabeth. But Mrs. Bennet quickly accepts him as a fine fellow. In this chapter, that is chapter 14, we can also see that an indirect view of Lady Catherine, an unpleasant woman who surrounds herself with wopes like Collins, is presented. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 15. In chapter 15, Mr. Collins, having a good house and a sufficient income, intends to marry and has visited Longbourn with a view of choosing one of the Bennet daughters, as I have said before. If he finds one handsome and admirable enough, he considers that this will make amends for his inheriting her father's estate. He is attracted to Jane, but Mrs. Bennet makes it clear that her eldest daughter's affections are engaged elsewhere. Mr. Collins then turns his attention to Elizabeth. Okay, so as if it is some mechanical way, as if he has to choose one of them, and so he moves from one to the other in the hierarchical way. The sisters walk into Meryton accompanied by Mr. Collins, who has begun to bore Mr. Bennet a great deal. They encounter an officer friend, Mr. Denny, who introduces them to a newly arrived colleague, Mr. Wickham, a young man of good looks and pleasing manners. This group is joined by Bingley and Darcy, who have been riding down the street on their way to Longbourn to inquire after Jane's health. Both Darcy and Wickham seem extremely disconcerted at the sight of each other, and Darcy and Bingley ride on after a very short meeting. Denny and Wickham leave the girls, and Collins at the door of Mrs. Phillips's house. The girls' aunt promises to invite Wickham to supper the next evening if they will come as well. The girls are delighted. Mr. Collins, on his return to Longbourn, praises Mrs. Phillips's manner and politeness. So, the purpose of Mr. Collins' visit to Longbourn is clear. It is to win one of the Bennet girls as a wife, which is obvious for him. He is easily able to shift from Jane to Elizabeth, though he has no feeling for either. So, marriage for him is just a deal. This is one way of finding a wife quickly, but it is hardly a sound foundation for marriage that is being presented over here. Jane Austen deplores such an approach towards marriage. Such are marriages of convenience, designed less for the happiness of the individuals involved than for some exterior purpose. A second alien element is included into the life of the Bennet family, Wickham, who will play an important role in complicating the actions of the novel, and this character is introduced in this chapter. So Before we move into Wickham and the next chapter, let's discuss the character of Mr. Collins up till now, as it has happened. Mr. Collins's full name is William Collins. William Collins takes his place among the best comic characters of not only all works of Jane Austen's but of English literature as a whole. Okay, his character is revealed in the first letter he writes to Mr. Bennet. There is a mixture of servility and self-importance in it, and Elizabeth asks her father whether he can be a sensible man. Her father replies that he cannot, and that he would not make an interesting study, and that he is impatient to see him. Besides writing about his own good fortune in securing the favour of Lady Catherine de Bourgh and his determination to please both her and God as much as lay within his power, the worthy clergyman adds that he is sorry for the entail of Longbourn estate on him, and purposes to make whatever amends might lie within his power. The reference to the entail provides the ridicule of Mr. Bennet and Elizabeth, and they expect to see one of the oddest creatures of their experience. Mr. Collins does indeed prove to be one of the oddest characters. He is a young man of 25. Jane Austen gives a brief account of his early life and his character to explain his pompous and formal behavior to Mrs. Bennet, whom he is to succeed at Longbourn, and his 5 fair daughters. Nature had not endowed him with good sense, and he had not improved a bit by his education and contact with society. He had been under guidance of an illiterate and miserly father, and this had produced a habitual humility to him. But an early prosperity consequent on the favour of Lady Catherine had made him conceited. There is a mixture of servility and self-importance in him. As pointed out by Mr. Bennet, he is inordinately obsequious to everything connected with Lady Catherine, and excessively proud of his position in life. These two aspects, combined with his absolute lack of sense, making him the most comic creature in the novel. He alludes tactlessly to the entail in the course of his conversation with the Bennets, and praises his patroness in fulsome manner. He is not ashamed to display his servility towards her. Mr. Bennet enjoys his absurdities very much during the first day, and as a critic puts it, one of the golden moments in the life of the lover of oddities when Mr. Collins admits that his compliments to Lady Catherine were partly premeditated and partly born on the spur of the moment. But the entertainment given by his absurdities lasts only for a day. Mr. Bennet gets tired of him soon, and Elizabeth too feels that they had enough of him. But Mr. Collins forces himself on his fair cousins and intends to set about a plan for choosing one of them as his partner in life. His first choice falls on Jane, but Mrs. Bennet tells him that she is likely to be engaged soon. Mr. Collins is not disturbed by this information at all. He transfers his attention to the next in birth and beauty that is Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet encourages him heartily in his new choice, and the two make an admirable pair. Okay, so what we see here is that Mrs. Bennet is only after getting a daughter's married. She is not considerable enough to think what kind of man, what kind of relationship, what kind of life they would lead. Okay, we will end it here. We will discuss the next chapter in next classes. Okay, thank you.